Okay. Quite a busy week. To open stick into some.
Hi, hello. No, we can't seem to hear you. There's no sound coming through.
Alona's muted at the moment, according to the.
We're getting a few comments come through. I can't hear anything.
Yeah, there should be sound with this recording.
I know. Denise played back something the other day, and there was no sound. He couldn't get sound on it. Seems to be some sort of glitch that occurs.
I'm hearing at the moment.
You are?
Yeah. I can hear you anyway, Martin.
Oh, sorry. I thought you could hear the narration on the no. No, but if she's playing a video and it's got sound on it, there seemed to be a glitch where the sound wasn't coming through the narration.
Well, that's a different question altogether.
Yeah, exactly.
Sent a message to say to unmute, but there's no audio coming through here.
I can hear somebody typing very loudly.
Well, that would be me because my keyboard's next to the machine. I do beg your pardon for having a rattly key.
All right. Welcome. Our organizers for today, Elvin White and Company.
Hello.
Hi, Ben.
I'm just going to share my screen. Am I good to do that?
Yeah. Go for it.
Cool. Can everyone see that?
I can.
Cool. Then let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on securely handling fonts in PDF. I'm Elvin White. I lead the SDK development team at Glasswall, and we've basically developed an SDK for file inspection, remediation, and sanitization for several file formats. Just a bit on how this session sort of came about. We've been working on an interesting project with one of our partners to do with sort of transferring documents between low security and high security networks. When the project was sort of proposed, we thought, perfect, we can do that, not a problem, until we were asked the question, well, how do you handle fonts? And I guess the answer to that would be not as well as we should. So normally we'd sort of have discussions on how we'd overcome this barrier internally. The summit came about and we thought, okay, great opportunity to kind of discuss this publicly and sort of start defining a standard approach for handling fonts. And if we're going to do that, why not start with the most interesting file format, which is PDF? But my hope is that whatever we discuss and the outcomes of today can actually be applied to several file formats. So I'm not sure what everyone's expectation of the session was, but it isn't a session where we sort of share the perfect solution, but rather it's to try and sort of come up with that perfect solution. So now, in terms of how this session is structured, a few of my colleagues are going to basically share some of their presentations to sort of help set the context of the discussion. So we'll have Jonathan Green basically going through an overview on PDF fonts. We'll have Greg Mann touching on the security risks presented with fonts within PDF. We'll have Stephen sort of going through some of our use cases, our internal use cases, and how sort of the font problem sort of manifests itself in that context. And we'll sort of continue on with the discussion at that point. And sort of the topics that we were hoping to cover for the discussion are basically how can we safely remove embedded fonts from a file. We'll touch on externalizing and scanning embedded fonts with AV products. We'll cover some font validation, sort of for the tools and libraries and sort of how effective this is. We'll also touch on sort of font whitelisting. And generally cover any other approaches that we've sort of missed out from these topics. And lastly, I guess we'll touch on how the vulnerabilities related to fonts kind of how they are in context in comparison to sort of vulnerabilities in other sections of a PDF document. So without taking up more of your time, I'm basically going to invite Jonathan to kind of go through the overview of PDF fonts within the structure of a PDF document. Jonathan, I guess this is your cue. It's all yours.
Consider me cued. Okay. Okay, everybody seeing that?
Yep.
Everybody hearing me?
Yep.
Okay, well, I assume we're good to go. All right. Well, Elvin's already kind of introduced me. My name's Jonathan Green. I've been working on the Glasswall PDF engine, if you like, since I joined the company some 7 or 8 years ago. So I'm probably what passes for the PDF domain expert within the company. Although if anybody has actually looked through the PDF spec, you'll realize that that's an awful lot of domain to be an expert in. Anyway, okay, so fonts and how they manifest in PDF. Okay, first thing, I guess we start with the basics here. What's PDF? Adobe Portable Document Format. Very popular platform, agnostic file format for distributing documents. Although it does many more things than that. You can embed all sorts of content, multimedia stuff, video, even 3D models in there. And it's an open standard maintained by ISO, so it is at least well documented and accessible. Key features: capture documents from pretty much any application, send electronic copies anywhere. It's designed so that most things are represented in something approximating to text, so it survives being sent through email or whatever quite nicely. And you can view and print it on pretty much any platform and get a reasonably accurate reproduction of what the originator of the document actually intended. Okay, key to that and how things look is obviously going to be fonts and characters. So start with some simple definitions here. A character, abstract symbol, A, B, C. A glyph, a specific graphical rendering of a character. And a font is something which defines a set of glyphs for a particular character set. So if you look at that document there, you can see I have a little string of characters, some as characters, some as hex numbers. They go into a font. They have a popular Comic Sans, and out comes a very particular graphical representation. That nice, cheerful, informal Comic Sans, much derided, but well, I quite like it actually, but there you go. And that defines some terms for us. What do fonts look like in PDF? Now what you should see on the screen there is pretty much the simplest manifestation of a font in PDF. It's a dictionary, which is PDF's sort of basic unit of representing information. It tells you what kind of dictionary it is, obviously a font. It tells you what kind of font it is with the subtype, in this case a type 1 PostScript font. It applies a name for it, which allows you to reference it from elsewhere. It tells you what font that's based on, and it tells you what the encoding is to use when it is going to use when it maps from character strings to actual glyphs. Now, the base font there I've chosen for the example is Helvetica. One of the things about this is it's one of what's called the standard 14 base fonts, which are required to be supported by all conforming readers. So if you use one of those fonts, which are the usual sort of popular Helvetica, Times Roman, Wingdings, whatever, then you can assume that the receiving appliance will be able to display that without packaging any more information, which is nice because that gets us around, you know, the whole issue of embedding font files in the first place. There are variations on that. You have multiple master fonts, which basically define a font in terms of sort of two versions of a font, and you can kind of morph between those to generate sort of italic, bold, whatever. There are true type fonts, there are type 3 fonts. Type 3 fonts are interesting because they're self-contained. The actual font itself will contain a set of PDF graphic operators to actually render the glyphs. You have composite fonts, which are kind of variations which support large character sets, like some of the Far Eastern languages, Chinese, Korean, whatever. And the other thing you can have is you can have font subsets. So if your document only uses a subset of a particular sort of character set, say there are no L's or X's or W's in, then, well, you don't have to put all the information to render those in, so you can just send the subset of the font across. Extra things you can have on top of that, you can have what we call font descriptor dictionaries, which have information on font weight, dimensions, things like that. We can specify custom encodings, which vary from the standard sort of ANSI type ones. We can supply embedded font files, which are the ones that we probably are most concerned and worried about. And we have things like what's called C maps, which are sort of extended encoding information which goes in with composite fonts for supporting, you know, sort of large character sets. So what do we currently validate in Glassroll at the moment? Well, if it's in the PDF spec, ISO 32000, then we check that all the required objects for a font are present. We check that within those objects, all the dictionary keys required are present and that the values are correct. If there are any optional keys, we check that they have the right types. We check that they're consistent with the other keys. We check that all the values are within range where specified or implied. We check that where things like encodings are supplied as an array, that they have an appropriate number of values consistent with the rest of the description and the dictionary keys, which, you know, obviously guards against things like buffer overruns, and also enables you to potentially spot where somebody's for good or ill supplied more data than is strictly needed, which might be just an innocent piece of blank space, or might be the payload for an exploit. We don't know. And what don't we currently validate? Well, at the moment, we have an embedded font program. We don't really validate that at all, beyond establishing that it really is an embedded font program and that we can open it. Now, why is that? Well, an outline font, an embedded font, be it a true type or PostScript or whatever, effectively it's a set of non-trivial true type font or PostScript programs written in the Turing complete programming language. So what you're dealing with is more akin to an executable file than anything else. Many of the libraries which things used to render fonts, this will be touched on later by Greg, have common origins going back a very, very long time, and as a result, they share vulnerabilities which make it possible to craft malicious fonts which exploit those vulnerabilities while still being syntactically and semantically valid. So there is a limit to what we can do to actually establish that the font's fair and safe, even if it is internally consistent and correctly formatted. And an example of that is this one font vulnerability to rule them all, CVE 2015-0093 or 2015-3052, depending on who you ask. There is a description of that, which I've put a URL for there and a link to a paper describing that. Basically, it demonstrates how you can actually sort of embed malicious code inside the snippets of code which actually render glyphs. And that's the background. So that's me done. Over to you again.
Cool. Before we move on, I'll just sort of ask the question, does anyone have any questions related to what Jonathan's just gone through? I think that means no. So in that case, I am going to hand over to Greg, who will go through some of the security risks within fonts in PDF.
Well, hopefully, can everybody see my screen?
All good.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Thank you. So, so this is kind of a little bit of I've just done a little bit of a background check on some of the things that people are saying are the issues around fonts within PDF. That's kind of out there on the internet, and it's kind of put together reasonably short notice, so it's not as comprehensive as it could be, but it's kind of to give a flavour of the types of issues to do it. So when I kind of did my search around the main thing, I found pretty much the same issue that Jonathan had, this one font vulnerability to rule them all. But the main thing it highlights from a risk perspective for PDF is it's not necessarily a risk because of the PDF, it's what's going to interpret the PDF. And this particular article is really valuable because it gives, I think, for me, a really good indication of the types of the types of vulnerability that may be there in some of these older libraries that are used within PDF readers, or or the things that render fonts on your screen. Now, the good news is from this particular article, a lot of these vulnerabilities have been fixed in some of the particular target platforms they were testing on, which was PDF reader and within Windows. But potentially there are older products or other products that are still going to use perhaps the core of those common libraries or a modified version of it where not all those particular vulnerabilities have actually been removed. The other major source of potential vulnerabilities is we're taking it from the NSA's PDF inspection standardization guide. And this is quite handy because it kind of gives you not only what the read type issue might have, but also it focuses on information hiding or disclosure of confidential information. And there's a very nice sample summary at the end of the PDF ISG, which for the sections that deal specifically with fonts, kind of says what type of issue you could have. What type of issue could you have for that particular, that particular construct in PDF? So for simple fonts, yeah, it could be a vector for an attack. It could be used for hiding information, and it could be used for some form of disclosure. So that is, I think, is a really good, that those particular sections are really good for kind of saying all the type of things that could actually be done. And I'm not necessarily going to go through, huge amount of detail, but these are what I've taken out from some of the from the ISG about the types of risks about, and I'll post these slides in the chat so people can have a look at them and get them later. So I'm not going to go through them in detail here. But it gives the type of thing about how information can be hidden, by inserting data within some of the fonts. It could be steganography, or it could be in some of those areas where there's an attack vector. It's like, what's the loopholes? And it is, the key to it is that effectively, if you've got embedded fonts, it's a big chunk of binary. It could be anything, and you've got and it's quite a complex thing to actually validate. So you've actually got no idea what that might actually be. But there you are. There's a number of different risks around each of, from the ISG, from each of the different font constructs. There's different risks that could come through in the PDF file from outside, and especially in our context, where we're talking about moving from a low security setting into a high security session. You kind of get to understand why it is quite relevant, and why some of our customers are concerned about it. So that was kind of really, that's kind of the main things that we've actually seen. Is it's about how, it's how attacks that are based around how the glyphs are actually rendered. It's about data hiding, and about data disclosure. Has anybody got any other any ideas or any other things of potential vulnerabilities or risks from PDF fonts? Share. No, that's pretty much it from me. So thank you, Joshua. And back to you, Elvin.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. Next, I'll invite Stephen, who pretty much go through a couple of use cases that we're working on, and sort of what sort of challenges we're facing related to fonts. So Stephen, over to you.
Just sort of showing up the screen to see if that needs to work. Okay. You see that okay?
Yes, we can. You are a bit faint though, Stephen.
Sorry, point the microphone the right way helps, doesn't it?
It definitely does, much better.
Right. Yeah, it's only a couple of little screens just to share, but this is kind of where, as you were saying earlier, this is where this sort of originally was sort of highlighted as a sort of big concern. The domain for the client that we were working with, they've specifically been concerned about any binary data coming through. So I'll just go on to a couple of other screens. I'll come back to this slide in a moment. Their concern was along the lines of binary data. So we had a number of blocks of data within files that we processed where we'd identified what they are, and quite happy that they were benign, and maybe carried out some forms of validation on them and left it at that. But those highly secure domains are very rigid about this, that anything that is any appreciable lump of binary data needs to be identified or worked out what it is, or turned into some sort of form that can be very, very clearly validated within their system. So there are a number of elements like that we've come across that we're looking to deal with in different ways. But fonts were the biggest chunk that they'd certainly also come across as a big problem. And their solution, generally speaking, has been to whitelist. So they would identify a whole series of fonts in file types that they're dealing with, extract out the fonts, do various tests on them to confirm that they have no no payloads of any danger within them, put them together as a whitelisted set of fonts, and then they would require that those fonts files are removed from any incoming file and a placeholder be inserted. That then allows them to say, right, we'll reinsert that font into the file at the other end when we reconstruct it, and we'll be happy that on the high side of our system, the high security side, only those safely checked files, fonts are in use within the files. Now that's obviously something that we can look at doing, and we're sort of looking at saying how perhaps we can actually extend on that and actually create our own sets of whitelists and maybe even make those public, but certainly need to sort of effectively follow that same sort of mechanism. Clearly there are details of this that are difficult to do because certain forms of these binary files are not, sorry, these forms of fonts aren't necessarily stored in the same way. So we can potentially extend this idea to how we might use this type of font handling generally, rather than in the high security settings where there are a complete removal of fonts and reinsertion at the other end. In our normal processing, we may look to actually replace these fonts with a whitelisted set as part of the job. And that's something that we need to sort of look at doing, but there are, as Jonathan's alluded to, there are lots of potential detailed problems around that, which I'm sure we'll sort of get on to discuss in a little while. So this is sort of really how they've come into the picture and how they've been brought up, that we've looked at how we're dealing with things, that we take fonts and we don't really do anything other than validate them against ordinary third-party font libraries, font handler code, and they want a far more rigid testing that these are safely removed and reinserted at the other end. And this is perhaps then something we need to look at, an equivalent mechanism in our normal processing, alongside this more difficult to do situation for the cross-domain solutions. So that's really just the outline of what's raised this issue higher up in our consciousness at the moment. And I guess that's where we sort of got a jumping off point to start talking about how we might deal with this and what sort of problems it will cause. I'll leave that there. I'll leave that to share for a moment, or should we come back to that later if you want it?
I think we could probably come back to that later.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. Any questions for Stephen? Cool, guess not. What I'll do is I'll share my screen again, just so I can have those sort of topics highlighted to everyone. Let's see if I can find that now. There we are. Cool. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So, in light of what Jonathan mentioned, in that it's going to be pretty tricky to validate fonts in PDF, I naturally feel that the best approach would probably be the first item on this list, which is how can we safely remove embedded fonts from a file. With that, we obviously have to also consider what we need to do to replace those embedded fonts if we are pulling them out, and what impact that will actually have on the appearance of the document. In which case, if it has a significant impact, we need to figure out how we reduce that. So are there any sort of thoughts around that?
Does PDF have a fallback for when it can't find a font that it's supposed to use? So if you place or if you remove the embedded font, would it then render using a default font?
I think that's a question for Jonathan.
Oh, I'll unmute myself. Hear me okay?
Yep.
According to the spec, the guidelines for a compliant reader are that where it can't find an embedded font or can't use it for any reason, it should try and find one of the 14 either built-in or assumed present on the system fonts and find the closest match in terms of the font metrics, you know, sort of size and weight and things, and encoding, and then render using that. So yes, it will fall back to a default. It will try to do it intelligently on the basis of the font descriptor and map it to one of the built-in ones. How successful that is will depend on things like, you know, whether there's any custom I beg your pardon, any custom encoding going on for, you know, slipping extra characters in or you know, that kind of stuff. Probably safe, probably fairly safe with normal Latin text. But as soon as you go outside the sort of like the European American parochial world of English language stuff, you're in a bit of a minefield there.
Yes, if you get into Chinese and Japanese, Korean character sets, I mean, we're in a whole new world anyway. I think.
You're in a whole world of pain.
Yeah. So it's very, very difficult. And of course, what impact will this have on the appearance of the document? Well, that really kind of depends on whether the replacement font maps closely to the font you've removed anyway. So that's...
It kind of depends on how sophisticated the typography is in the document. If there's a lot of clever sort of microspacing and kerning to fit things neatly, then, you know, you potentially get something very ugly indeed with overlapping characters or big gaps. And I mean, one particular case where, you know, I have seen issues when files are being misprocessed by us is that it's fairly common for some companies to have sort of like, what's the word, logo types. If you look at companies like Siemens and the like, they'll have a company name in a very specific font and color and things. And they will achieve that by using a custom font with just those characters in. And usually the encodings will not be anything sensible, so you'll end up with something really bizarre looking for those.
That sort of thing be whitelisted?
Well, that's a good question. It could be, but then how do we distinguish between, you know, the genuine whitelisted item and, you know, something which has been crafted as a substitute for that with, you know, broadly similar characteristics and the same name?
Some way of pinpointing the font.
Yeah, fingerprint it somehow.
Whatever, you know, just
possibly, perhaps.
It's about fonts to make an intelligent suggestion, but some way of pinpointing that set of fonts as being whitelisted using some sort of code based on what's the content.
Yeah, effectively fingerprinting it.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
Jonathan.
Hello.
Oh, it's Vin here.
Hi, Vin.
The PDF standard's been around for a very long time, relatively speaking. Is this issue been around as long as PDF? And how does the wider community see it? Do we know?
The answer is yes, it has been around for as long as PDF's been around. If anything, it's probably got something worse, somewhat worse, because recommendations for early versions of the PDF standard were that if you were using one of those standard 14 fonts, then you didn't have to supply an embedded version. Later versions of the format specify that, well, actually, we'd rather you did supply an embedded font, even if it's one of the standard ones, So arguably, it's got worse.
Yeah, sorry. Go on, Vin.
I was just going to ask, and this is one of the things I was never sure from my kind of reading through with when you embed a font, whether it's similar to, say, in Office. When you embed a font in Office, when you tell Office to embed a font, you've got a choice of, do you embed the whole font, or do you embed the bits that you need for the document? How does PDF work in that respect?
Well, I mean, the answer is it depends what generates it.
Okay.
I believe if you got Acrobat, it's fairly intelligent about generating font subsets. Other products, like for instance, PDF printer drives built into other programs and things, somewhat less clever.
So it becomes quite hard from a document to actually kind of fingerprint a particular font, because it could be any part of the actual original font.
Yeah. But I mean, like a lot of other things in PDF, it's up to the generating program, which mostly means Adobe, but quite often doesn't. So you can't really generalize that. I mean, I believe it's considered good practice to subset fonts, but you know, by no means is that, you know, sort of enforced.
I mean, perhaps related to that, regarding, you know, being around a long time. I noticed on one of the slides that it talked about different versions of PDF and certain exploits. I know basically what it all boils down to at the end is what you've got in front of you in terms of the content of the PDF. But does the version number at the start of the PDF file actually have any meaning? Because I know from conversations I've heard that sometimes it will say it's this particular version, but yet it will use structures, etc., from later versions. And I'm wondering if that's not necessarily an issue, but is it something we really care about, is what the versioning is specified as in the PDF document itself?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is in Glassdoor, we try to care about it, and we try to check that constructs in use match the format version declared at the front. And you know, I believe that if we find mismatches in there, you have to excuse me, there are parts of this code I haven't been in for a very long while, that it will actually update that version identifier to, you know, the earliest one which supports all the constructs in use. However, it's one of these things that it's, because it's built to be extremely robust, people take all sorts of liberties with that, and the readers are very tolerant of it. So
I mean, that presumably that change is a remedy item that we tell the client we've changed this because the version number was wrong. Or
doesn't really sort of impact too much on sort of like how fonts are handled, because most of this stuff's been in since, you know, one point, not very many.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting digression for another time.
Yes, no, it's just I noticed on one of the slides, I think it might have been the ISG one, it did pertain to version numbers. There was a mention of version numbers on there, and that's what made me think about that.
Yeah, Martin, so it's funny if I was trying to find the text to actually kind of share it, but because I remember just read it. So the ISG fundamentally says that the version number in the PDF header is a recommendation. It's not an absolute. It is to this exact spec. And there are different constructs or different ways of doing some parts of the file, because I kind of noticed that when I've kind of looked at the raw binary for some of the files that we've received and what it looks like after Glasswall. So there are some slightly different ways of constructing some of the font libraries and how they get referenced.
Okay.
Welcome to my world.
Is there a way we can actually kind of look at what the files look like on here? Could you open up one of the fonts and we can kind of see what it is that we're working with more directly?
Has anyone got a PDF file with a font in it we can pull up? Because the text editor will show that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I can find
Which
something.
depends. Are we talking about at the PDF level or actually at the embedded font file level?
Because you showed us the
Preferably at the embedded font file level, but you know, if you, however you feel is appropriate.
Was there more to that dictionary? You showed us a dictionary which specifies the type and subtype, etc. But was there the actual content in it somewhere?
Yeah, I mean that was an absolute minimal representation.
Yeah.
Any luck finding something, Greg?
So I'm just gonna it's going to be a very basic thing. If I can share,
Okay.
do you want to?
Yep.
Find good old notepad. So I'll kind of go through this a bit. Font. So so this is not necessarily where it's going to be, and it's. I remember this is a real pain. I think just trying to find it. So if I'm right, Jonathan, if I can find that object, it should be in the font.
It should, yes.
Yeah. But I've noticed with some of these ISG ones when I've gone through, so if I do.
I mean, I have a script that pulls out all the objects. There's probably plenty around. We just need, presumably, it's just a.
Somewhere within this document, there should be an object 2570.
Yep.
Which.
That's assumed, of course, that it's not actually hiding inside an object stream somewhere.
Well, that was the problem I think I found with this. Is I think that sometimes they're actually. I think I found when I was looking at this yesterday that a lot of the actual fonts are actually hidden in a content stream. The objects are in a compressed object stream.
Greg.
Yeah.
If you do your search for 2570 space 0 space obj.
Yes, I was going to say there must be a shortcut to that.
Cool. Several times anyway. No.
You want to make that lowercase?
No, you've missed.
No, you're missing a 0.
0 obj. That's it.
Where we are. So I suspect it's actually embedded in. I think they're embedded in content streams.
Yeah. Yes, this is one point where I should have had one of these handy, but
yeah.
Sorry, and I had to be the one to ask.
No. It's worth asking.
It really shouldn't be so. How do I get out of this?
So I think it's see if I can.
And unfortunately, all my examples are on the wrong side of our work VPN for me at the moment, so I can't get them over here easily.
Isn't that
I
always
think
what
what I'll do
happens?
is if we carry on the conversation, I'll see if I can find a good example, just to kind of illustrate it. I think it's
Thank you for that, Greg.
Thank you.
Cool. While Greg does that, shall we sort of continue on with the discussion?
I'm all good.
Cool. So
I seem to be looking away, by the way. I have a second screen over here, which I'm looking at other stuff on, so it's
perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there's obviously the risk that if you replace if you remove the fonts and sort of we've got the option of it utilizes its fallback font, which basically
you put that slide up that had those questions on.
Yep, I can do. Just give me a second. This time I'm not going to do it in sort of presentation view because I can't use the rest of my machine when it's in that mode.
No, no. Well, it was useful to have that there, I thought.
Cool. Just give me a second. Let me. I have no idea where my Zoom icons disappeared to. It's not popping up on the screen.
You're not on a taskbar at the bottom.
It is, but when I click on it, nothing comes up. Oh, there you go. Found it. So now, if I just share that. Can everyone sort of see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Back to what I was saying. You mentioned that there's a potential that it could actually fall back to a default, but with that we could struggle with sort of different encodings. For instance, other complex encodings. So what would be an alternative? Is there a possibility that we could have a set of predefined fonts that somehow we can detect whether they're compatible with particular types and substitute them?
How would you do that without actually knowing how they were supposed to render in the first place? Because I mean, it's a mapping exercise, and you kind of like having to try and second guess what the mapping is going to be without necessarily knowing what the content actually is, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, just kind of firing from the hip. So
no.
So what alternatives do you see, Jonathan?
Well, that's a tough one, really. I mean, there is no universal answer, I don't think. Now, I mean, if we take the example of like where you're looking at the sort of CDS case, where you probably have a subset of documents moving from a known source to a known destination, then yes, you can have like sort of verified and whitelisted fonts in place on the high side, because you know what you're expecting from the low side to a large extent. As a more general solution, then really you sort of like reduce to guessing that it's going to be one of the standard encodings, which will probably work reasonably well without too much sort of havoc for sort of basic sort of Western European alphabets, where worst cases you sort of get some odd ligatures replaced with something else, or vice versa. However, as soon as you move outside that world, all bets are off.
I was wondering if there is capability in Adobe Reader, not Adobe Reader, but in the standard Adobe applications to edit the font. Is that something that we should possibly try or we should look at?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, Ajit. We've actually been looking at, I mean, you've probably come across it in other contexts, but there's a product from a company called Trom, which is a very powerful, very flexible sort of suite of applications and libraries for manipulating PDF files in all sorts of ways. And I know Steve's been sort of having at least a cursory look at that to with a view to sort of like identifying and extracting fonts. Now, whether it includes a verification engine, I don't know, because I mean, of course, the other option you've got here is if you can actually extract the font, then you can pass it as a file to a standard AV antivirus solution to scan for certainly known exploits, or you can do things like try and load it up into something to render it in a sandbox or something like that. So I think there are potentially sort of third-party things you can do, but How easy and realistic that would be, don't know. Suggestions welcomed. That's
Yes.
where
Vin here.
Yep.
I'm just going back to the slide that Steve showed, which is the cross-domain diagram. Apologies if not, I'm not up to speed with the requirements on this. What I mean, was there a client specifically asking for a particular solution, or were they just inquiring as about what we can do about this?
No, it is a particular requirement, and it's they put forward their current solution that they do using other tools, which is the complete removal of the font at the low side, replacement, marking it with some identifier saying what they thought that font was, and then the reinsertion of that on the other end from a whitelist. Now, it may be the case that the situations they've tried doing this, they've been able to extract nice, clean, true type fonts that happen to be, well catalogued examples that they've been able to use. Certainly, the impression I get from Jonathan is that PDF is a bit of a nightmare because it decides to do a lot of things where it stores stuff differently, and there's a possibility other tools will do the same thing. So that's where that perhaps becomes a little bit trickier. But that's the requirement there, is that they simply do not want exposure of lumps of binary data. So therefore, fonts are the biggest problem coming from the low side. So they don't want the original font file. They just want to know what the low side thought it was, and they'll insert a clean version at the other end. So that's their approach to it. And so we're looking at implementing something similar using our tool chain, and possibly borrowing that idea for our product normally. Now, obviously, that's where it gets interesting, because you think, well, how do you build a suitably large whitelist? I mean, there's probably thousands of fonts out there, probably hundreds of well-respected and well-listed ones, but there's probably thousands of custom built ones. So if somebody's grabbed one off the internet and think, well, it looks pretty and sticks it in, it's perfectly legitimate. But how do you verify that? Is a big problem.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I'd say you can probably get away with that in the case of the sort of the CDS rule, because as I say, you're probably looking at a limited range of sources and a limited range of ways of producing the document, so you can make assumptions. However, if you're looking into a wider world, less so.
Hey, this is Paul. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That customer had a very particular set of requirements that involved the trade-off of security over the documents looking perfect. So they were willing to get fonts which were close enough to represent the file, but they didn't care overly much about it being an absolute perfect representation of the original. So security trumped everything in their case. But I don't think that's going to be the situation with a lot of the use cases that we end up putting the glass wall into. The other thing that's top of mind is, I go back into my deep and dark history, and I can't tell you whether this has got any relevance, but it might be worth a quick look at. I used to be responsible for a PCX server product, and the issue there was whenever the stream was served up to represent on the local machine, the fonts weren't sent, so the PCX server itself had to manage a representative set of fonts. And I wonder whether there are font libraries and font sources and logic that we might be able to learn from looking at what PCX servers or X servers in general do on font handling.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly big libraries out there. I mean, Google Fonts, for example, is an enormous library of them, and I'm sure there's plenty of other beasts out there as well. So there's just something on that side I just did wonder about. Where we're talking about this problem of fonts, and I think this particularly came out, I was talking to Jonathan about the fact that PDF sometimes does subsets. I don't know if you touched on that much, where that perhaps becomes a problem if you've got fonts that have been rearranged differently. Is it is it perhaps an approach that we have to extract the sort of individual font elements somehow and create white of them down to sort of glyph level? If we can, I know that probably actually increases the problem, but I wonder if that's
that makes me want to run away screaming.
Well, it's just the idea of trying to put them in. If we're creating a set of whitelisted files, rather than in the different formats, whether we can do it at a level that gives you some compatibility. I don't know. It's just perhaps a slightly obscure idea, but I'm just wondering if that, in some respect, might actually reduce the amount of things that we need to look at, because you're then looking for matches. I mean, this is not something we can necessarily easily do.
White glyph level is what we're talking about here, is it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe on a sort of sample basis that you sort of take, you know, if you've got a particular, well, if someone's extracted out individual ones, like you say, they sometimes use a small subset, then your only way of checking those is to do them individually. But you might be able to use the same mechanism to perhaps do a sample. Just take a few sample glyphs,
well,
and say, are these in the big whitelist?
Yeah, where subsets are used, you do get the subset described. There will be effectively a lookup table of you know, character values to glyphs, or glyph indexes at least, and sort of like, you know, sort of things to indicate where the gaps where the subsetting takes place are. So it's not a random subset. It does actually describe what the subset is, which I guess helps a bit. But I say then, like, you know, if you're down to sort of looking for sort of equivalencies between glyphs, then like, well, you know, I mean, there could be multiple ways of drawing the same glyph, and how do you actually sort of compare them without, you know, sort of doing the whole rendering thing, which is, you know, it's working at a very, very low level, and you know, sort of potentially opening yourself up to the issue you're trying to guard against.
Yeah, I guess that is a problem, isn't it? I suppose it does sort of come back to the general. Well, I guess it comes back to the idea of, do you actually have to try and execute them in some sort of sandbox of some sort just to check that they do behave the way a font should behave? If there is a defined behavior, you know, can you say this piece of data should behave a particular way to indicate that it is a valid font?
Yeah, and hopefully spot any exploits being triggered in terms of things accessing illegal areas of memory, or you know, performing other nefarious things.
Yeah, it may be a case that that is the only sort of solution. I mean, we've generally gone to the process with our system is to break a file down into its smallest parts and validate the values. Well, maybe this is a point where a font has to be validated by some sort of controlled rendering.
The nuclear option there is that you simply render the document and OCR it and convert it back using a known font, because then you've got.
Is it you know, one of the issues we're trying to deal with is the fact that, you know, it could be the rendering that actually causes the problem.
Yeah. Although if we're doing that, we can do the rendering in a controlled environment, in a you know, a well buttoned up sort of sandbox on a virtual machine, whatever. So if anything does blow up, it's going to be, you know, in a controlled domain rather than on, you know, a customer's desktop or, you know, sort of server or whatever.
Well, perhaps that's where the sort of the global whitelist that we control comes into it. So perhaps if we can identify a font belonging to the whitelist, fine, we can say it's good. If we can't, then we can take it off into a little sandbox and test it.
Yeah.
And that could be an automated process and part of our suite of products.
And, you know, there are sandboxing tools. So, you know, you could just, like, you know, spin up the sandbox, put the, you know, the text you want to test into it, let it render it, and just see what happens.
Yeah, or you could even sort of exhaustively test that font, couldn't you?
Well, I mean, that's what you want to do in the sandbox.
In the sandbox, yes, but just so that you could verify that entire font contains meaning, working glyphs in it and nothing silly. Then you can then write the entire font goes in a whitelist for the next time it turns up somewhere.
Yeah, you could open it up in a sandbox, feed all the text in the document into it, and if the text in the document doesn't trigger an exploit or exploit-like behavior, then that certainly it's okay in that particular context.
Yeah.
And I guess that kind of sits in the same region as sort of scanning it with AV products effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'd probably throw that at it as well, wouldn't we?
Yeah. So I guess that's basically saying that we don't necessarily guarantee sort of that there won't be any risk related to that. We're just kind of minimizing that as much as possible.
Well, yeah. I think the only way you can eliminate the risk is simply to render and OCR. Otherwise, there will always be some window.
Again, maybe. So I was just going to say, maybe again it becomes another one of those selectable policy levels of security.
Because again, I mean, we can't. We can see the content, but we have no idea. What's going to happen to it once it's passed across the CDR boundary, and what tool it's going to be opened with. So, we don't know what the potential exploits are on that tool.
Yep. Just moving on to the third point on that list, which is sort of the font validation. And you touched on Stephen experimenting with some of these tools and libraries. So this is a question for yourself, Stephen, I guess. Do any of those sort of look promising, and what sort of level of protection do we get from actually validating those fonts? What nature of validation are we carrying out if we're using some of those tools?
No, what I was referring to, well, it's two things there. PDF Trom that was looking at, I was only looking at that in terms of what features it had in terms of removing and change and replacing with fonts. The font validation I was referring to was the TrueType font libraries that we use to just get a yay or nay back to say this looks like a font.
Which is what we do now.
Yeah.
We try and open the embedded fonts up with, I think it's the OpenType library, isn't it? And if that doesn't blow up, we say it's good. I mean, to be fair, we've been running this stuff for quite a long time in Glassmore. And has any customer ever reported, a case of an attack through a font, using a font as a vector, getting through? And that can tell you something about whether that's effective or not.
Yeah, to my recollection, I don't think we've actually had a case like that reported.
Yeah. Because I mean, the other thing there is that quite often if you have files containing exploits, there will be multiple telltales. So it could be that we're catching the fact that files have become malformed as a result of a clumsy font substitution taking place to get something containing an exploit in there, or because the particular sort of malware generating tool, file generating tool, not having a particularly good PDF, sort of renderer engine, and putting other malformations in which we do catch. But it would appear we're getting at least some value out of that approach, even if it's not to build standard for the heavyweight CDR applications.
I'll ask a question. What's the how do you define a valid font?
That's kind of the question we're really sort of trying to we're defining, isn't it? I guess.
At what level? I mean, at the PDF level, you know, we can check that the dictionaries are all present and that they're well formed and they're internally consistent. And then having done that, you know, we can actually sort of try and open the embedded font file if one's provided. And if that opens successfully, then we can say, at the moment, we say that's a valid file. So, you know, it kind of depends, you know, are we talking about PDF level or font file level? PDF level, I'm pretty damn confident that, you know, we're checking everything in the standard, that it's there, that the types are right, that the values are internally correct, and it's all generally well formed. It's when you get into the actual sort of the embedded font program that you know, here be dragons.
So that's actually an interesting question, Martin. So in relation to that, Jonathan, so obviously we're validating everything at the PDF level, but we obviously don't go into checking specific font structures, etc.
Nothing internal to the font file, to the embedded font file.
Yeah.
The font file it's not quite a binary blob, because we do attempt to open it with the own type library to see whether it is, you know, at that level a valid file, but we don't look inside it in any detail at the moment.
So theoretically, we could validate the structure, for instance, but
indeed we could. I mean, that would be a fairly sort of non-trivial thing to do.
Is anyone sort of aware of any vulnerabilities that exist from sort of compromises in that file structure, or are they all just down to sort of the font parsers just not being able to parse certain kinds of fonts, etc.?
Well, I mean, I mean, a lot of them, or some of them, some of the scary ones at least, do seem to be that when you actually sort of like execute the glyph code to actually write the glyphs, you can have a perfectly, you know, semantically valid and syntactically meaningful piece of code at that level, which is capable of triggering, you know, vulnerabilities inside the font rendering engine, in spite of everything being well formed.
Yep.
You know, it's like, you know, executing any other program that you can have, like, you know, a perfectly valid program which just happens to do something undesirable.
Now, do we get the opposite effect, where there are actually compromises in the structure of the font that then cause these problems? There's the reason I say that is you might not be able to sort of guarantee everything, but at least you can partly deal with a subset of those vulnerabilities.
I mean, I think, you know, it would certainly help. And you'd have the option of like using the analytical data which we get out of our program for what's actually in there, for like, you know, fingerprinting them to identify, you know, nasty stuff as we do in some other areas. And yeah, absolutely you could do that and there would be value in it. However, you know, there are specific known exploits, documented exploits, which it wouldn't necessarily catch. Which is, you know, that's the slightly frightening thing. And that example, which I sort of referenced on my last slide, and I think Greg referenced as well, describes exactly that. It's a valid, well-formed font, which nevertheless can blow up the font library and, you know, do undesirable things, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
I'm
so
just doing a, oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm just doing a quick kind of catch up, I guess, on PDF forensics, you know, being able to pull them apart and see what's in them. And that's fascinating. I am trying actually to figure out how to get down into accessing the actual font file. I don't know between one thing to the other which direction to go in for it, because I have, you know, what you had searched for, but in one particular file that I'm looking at, I have the object here, but how do you get down in there from there? I mean, that's a pretty,
yeah, we need sort of a concrete walkthrough as to how you look at how you look at the PDF file and then get to that font.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, I mean, I can pull it apart different ways. I can think of several that I could pull it apart, but I'm just wondering what will actually render it appropriately.
Not sure I quite understand the question. Are you just trying to sort of how to actually navigate internally within the PDF file with the binary to find the embedded fonts? No question.
It's all right. I'll look and see what I figure out. But is there a place where this kind of conversation is actually ongoing about these, or where it's going to be ongoing, like after the summit, about the ISGs and the?
I suppose.
Like there to be.
I suppose, yeah. For now, to probably be the Slack channels in the summit. So. If we don't have one for the fonts, I'm sure we can create one after this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So what I'm going to do is actually move on to sort of the last slide, just to sort of go through some of those topics. I know we touched on these. So I'm going to basically bring it back just to kind of capture it all. Font whitelisting. What are our options surrounding that? How could we make this work?
I guess the sort of, well, sorry, do you want to go, John, first?
I'd say, I mean, the obvious easy sort of quick and dirty solution is, well, cryptographic hashes. Look for cryptographic hash matches between the font files and the known good ones.
If we've got potentially subsets of the font files within the PDF, is that going to?
Well, always going to be a problem.
Stephen, yeah, you were going to say something.
Yes, in terms of identification, yes, the obviously MD5s or something of their nature. Maybe some more secure. I don't know which ones are whether any of those have any vulnerabilities themselves in terms of being able to be where you can bolt in stuff that makes the ID match even if it's got changes. But yeah, I go to sleep. What's Alexa talking to me for? I don't know. Yeah, I guess it is just unfortunately that huge job potentially of identifying large numbers of them from various sources and looking for suitable ways of identifying them. I guess the other trouble is working out, how many versions. I mean, TrueType obviously is one that's quite popular. Interesting. I just found a definition for that we could use for processing them. So I guess popular ones like that we could break down.
Absolutely.
And do some degree of validation on. So that's potentially the part of it. But yeah, certainly the main job I guess would be whitelisting from an ID number, or maybe doing a partial breakdown of it and then whitelisting elements of it so that you can just sort of say, well, this looks like a BOP file, we can break it down into parts, and then we can maybe dig further down to the smallest elements with it. And I guess that is where I'm thinking, the further we can go to the smaller lumps of the things, the more likelihoods we can check that these are actually valid pieces of information. But yeah, I think we'd end up with masses of information. But clearly, if we're going to do this through a cloud-based operation, then yeah, building some enormous database of identified and disassembled files is potentially the way we might have to go.
Well, is whitelisting something that should be on us? Is that not something applied to identify?
Sorry, I didn't catch me again, Matt.
whitelisting, is that something that should really be on us? Is that not something on an individual client basis? So they can produce their own hashes or supply their own known good files?
Yes and no, because I can imagine because we're basically taking our engine and using it in some of our other products, we'd also want some of that capability built into that. So yes, you'd want some way of extending that database. As Stephen says, you construct the database and you'd want a way of extending it, but I'm also sure that we'd probably want to use that ourselves internally.
Well, even where we're being used as part of another product offering, that product is part of the service. Should we really be making those decisions on behalf of clients?
The way I view it is, it's actually the next point I was going to touch on, which would be sort of the workflow. If the way I visualize this at the moment is, if you were to whitelist stuff, you'd, from the engine's perspective, from the SDK's perspective, you wouldn't actually have anything in there other than some sort of policy file that can sort of compare hashed fonts with a database somewhere. But in terms of internally, you wouldn't build that database into it.
Or which can export hash values for something else to do the comparison.
Sorry, repeat that, Jonathan, that you broke up on the first part.
Or which can export the hash values for something else to do that comparison.
Exactly. So I don't see that as sitting within the engine, but it's actually just exposing that capability.
But our friends upstairs may well want to do that stuff. So, but on that level, it would remain an internal issue. Yeah.
And the next question would be, for instance, what happens if we do encounter, say, a file with a font that's not part of that whitelist? Would it be a case of we reject it? Does it become a sort of configurable option? What do we do at that point?
I mean, that's got to be a user policy, hasn't it? Really. It's up to customers to determine the level of risk which they're comfortable with.
The same as any other piece of content that we deal with.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So I assume in that case it would be one of those. If it'd be like you have it, if it's not on the whitelist, you'd kind of go, okay, you have to remove it or replace it with some other default. One of the 14 as a default.
Or simply say we have confidence in our rendering engine and we're going to allow that through.
Yeah.
Or let the client decide anyway. They can decide to allow it, disallow it, or do whatever, the same as with everything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So the way I see it is a solution to this, or at least a step forward, would probably be sort of combining all the points that were sort of made today, in a sense that you'd probably want to do something along the lines of validating the structure that gives you a little bit more sort of security around that, exporting the fonts so you can scan that, you're presenting the option to scan it with a AV product or put it through a sandbox. You then have an option for sort of whitelisting, so based on policy and the hashes supplied. And I think the collection of that would then sort of help mitigate that risk a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be that would match, the things we do and the possibilities we to provide for sort of other file formats. I mean, the obvious comparison would be like, with your bitmap graphics, where we can let them through unchecked, or we can check them for structure and internal consistency and sort of repair them or pass them through, or we can export them and allow people to sort of like look for steganographic messages buried in them or whatever. So it would be exactly the same principle, really.
Yeah. Think that kind of sets us up for the next point, which is, are there any other sort of approaches that anyone can think of, other than Jonathan's earlier absurd one, which seemed like a lot of work to do with comparing glyphs? So,
I mean, it's kind of not necessarily.
That might be my bad idea.
That's the idea which I wanted to run away from screaming.
But I mean, we did talk at the start of the engagement with PA is about one of the requirements was potentially for a font camera, and it's not necessarily gets rid of all the risk around it, but potentially
that's basically what Elvin's just described.
Yeah,
I believe, isn't it, Elvin?
Yes, that's correct. That's just the validation structurally. Yep.
Well, we could certainly do TrueType. That one's, I found a public definition for that that looks quite healthy. So we could convert that into our form and use. I just tested it on Kotai, and it reads a font and breaks it down nicely into the sorts of lumps that we like. But there's still plenty of big binary lumps in it. But at least there's identifiers and checksums around it.
Yeah. They are all documented to a greater or lesser degree. But, I mean, sort of find you looking at a PostScript program at some level or other, or something that looks like a PostScript program. So you're at the sort of validating binary executables level of things,
Yeah. That's probably where you got the highest risk value. So it's that's going to be a difficult one. Is validating of the PostScript stuff for some of the some of the font types that you can get within the embedded fonts that actually aren't TrueType or OpenType or whatever it is called nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, you can validate that they're well formed and internally consistent, certainly.
Yep.
And that will, on the basis of our previous experience, in a lot of cases where people have tried to do clever things, they've almost invariably tripped up on the details, and some things ended up in there which we do spot as a non-conformance and stuff it that way. So they would certainly be valuing that, absolutely.
Cool.
Fairly sizable chunk of work there.
Any other approaches that anyone can think of?
I think we're probably exhausting it now. I think we've.
Yep. So I guess we move on to the last point, which is relative importance to other PDF vulnerabilities. So basically, the way I view this, at least from the Glasswall perspective, is how much of an impact do the risks presented by fonts in PDF sort of compare with other problems, other vulnerabilities within the PDF document? Is it a problem that we've got to address now? Sort of, is it an urgent issue?
So you mean we need a risk assessment?
Yeah.
But does that relate back to the ISGs for the PDF, and then it goes back to the risk levels that we were discussing in the ISG sessions?
I think from a pragmatic point of view, Elvin's kind of already answered this one earlier on when we were sort of discussing sort of how often we'd seen sort of issues with this stuff. And as I recall, like the answer was that to the best of our knowledge, we haven't actually had a font-based attack make it through Glasswall. On which basis you have to say that on the current levels checking, sort of to a commercial level, if not a sort of military and intelligence level, we've got the thing tolerably well managed.
Yeah. So if we're matching the ISGs, then we can provide a certain level of confidence.
Yeah. I mean that there's a danger of getting complacent and saying like, well, we haven't seen it yet, so it doesn't exist. However, so far so good.
Yep. Now, Greg, this is probably a question for yourself. In terms of coverage, the ISGs, you kind of went through that and pulled out some of those font-related vulnerabilities. Did they look to be of great magnitude in comparison to some of the others? Is there not a reasonable volume of them? What did that kind of look like to you?
To be quite honest, I haven't read all the different elements of the PDF ISG because it's a big long document, and I've kind of most of the discussion to have so far, I've kind of been selectively reading it and trying to get a grip of the type things that actually comes from. So I
Choose
can't say
40 pages, Elvin.
I can't necessarily say. I think one of the issues potentially with some of the ISGs, it tells you. I think you kind of do have to kind of look at it and have to make that judgment call, because it says it doesn't necessarily give you a severity of types of risk. It tells you what the risks are and the types of risk, but it's kind of that how important that is kind of missing out some of those documents. So without having to do that full read through and comparison, I think I'd be struggling to kind of.
Yeah, I think it's probably also worth considering that perhaps at this moment in time, it's not an area that people tend to exploit very, very often, but it could potentially be that area in the future. So that's something else to bear in mind as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I mean I think that's always, I think, from the discussion we've had on the ISGs, you kind of get this is like, you know, when that was kind of, this is the current known set of threats, but obviously somebody gets very clever and realize there's a potential exploit, you know, this could be something else there. So I mean, for me, the thing is that it's all about, you know, the renderers and how they actually deal with it. And I think probably we'd probably be better off sort of looking at a more general font-based, you know, what's the issues around font-based vulnerabilities. We know, certainly with what we're doing, you know, some of our clients are really quite paranoid about fonts, because they've obviously, I suspect, they've either seen something or experienced something in the past that's had really quite a severe impact on them. So I think it's probably something that could potentially be an issue for us later on. But as I say, we've not seen it so far to that level.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hey, Elvin, it's Paul.
Yep.
Just one of our email customers at the moment is expressing an interest in exactly what we do with fonts. I think I've talked to him about them before. I wouldn't say that's influencing their continuation of use of our software, but it's certainly something they're interested in. And I think it'd be worth checking with Max as well, because he had dealings with one technical evaluator who did raise the issue of font vulnerabilities. So if you want a source of measuring relative importance, those are the two. I can certainly put you in touch direct with that customer if you want to talk to them.
Yep, that sounds good. That sounds good. Cool.
Stephen's just posted up an image of using the Katai application. Well, I think worth looking at while you're on here to see how it's actually dissected the true type font.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyone hasn't spotted the note going up. Chat.
Cool. I guess we're kind of coming to a close now. So I guess my question would be, is there anything else we'd like to sort of discuss surrounding handling fonts in PDF before sort of summarizing the session?
Kind of guessing that it's probably, you've covered a lot there. It probably covers generally fonts in most, in fact, PDF probably is the more difficult one to do stuff with, I think, from what I've chatted to Jonathan about. I get the impression that the Office frameworks are a little bit more friendly and easier to grab the info out and deal with. So yes, I think it's going to be the detail of doing it. That's going to be our problem. But clearly, doing something with them, at least doing some of the additional verification, is going to be an improvement over what we currently got. So maybe some first cut cameras to at least do some sort of structural checking, so we've got some sort of feedback. I think maybe even that degree of breakdown may in itself be, you know, valuable to some of the clients who are concerned about it, that we can actually say, well, that's no longer a font in a block, is actually here's a dissected version of it. So that may give a bit more, warmer feeling to those concerned clients.
Okay, cool. I think we're pretty much coming to a close, so I'm just going to summarize this, and I'll probably run through it for with the group, and sort of I'll ask you questions on where I was unclear, and just kind of draw this to a conclusion. So we touched on everything here. So how can we safely remove embedded fonts from a file? How do we replace those embedded fonts, or what do we replace them with? What sort of impact do they have on the appearance of the document, and how can we reduce that impact? And if I recall correctly, we certainly can sort of remove those embedded fonts. We can sort of rely on the default font, the fallback font, but there's implications in that the document appearance may not resemble the original very much, and I think we also sort of have challenges with sort of if we're going to replace them with something, how do we identify a suitable replacement for it? Does that kind of capture it?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think in terms of externalizing and scanning embedded fonts with AV products, certainly seems like a potential option, and will probably provide some benefits. Not 100% perfect, but it will help in reducing that risk. So we can kind of potentially put those through AV products and sandboxes. I think those were the suggestions. Is that correct? Am I capturing everything on that point as well?
You are.
Yeah, I think our web API systems obviously would benefit from that.
Yep. I think we also agreed that in terms of font validation, that it's actually a good idea to do that. It will help in reducing some of those risks. There are tools and libraries that, Stephen, you mentioned a couple. I think you mentioned in there PDF Tron, and I think you mentioned another tool. What tool was that? Just I haven't got that one noted.
Well, I just posted up.
Yeah.
That was a file structure tool called, I don't even pronounce it, Katai, I think.
Katai, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, cool. And we can definitely do more around the sort of font validation area. If I go on to the next slide, font whitelisting, definitely an option as well. We sort of discussed how we could do this, and so it came to a conclusion that it'd be a good idea to sort of hash the fonts and produce a database that we can then cross-check against, and based on policy settings decide whether we're going to reject, allow the file, etc., etc. But that's not driven by our engine if we're talking in Glasswall terms, but instead a policy controllable feature basically. The one point I don't know if we touched on actually is what happens to the files that are not part of that whitelist? How do we feed that information back into the system? Do we? I think we did touch on it, didn't we?
Well, yeah, standard model. Sort of.
You'd have to end up rejecting that file, wouldn't you, if you couldn't insert something that you think was going to give it? Yeah. Well,
it becomes policy again, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Policy driven.
I think, as we were sort of saying earlier, some of our clients are not so concerned about the quality of the readability of the document if things are removed from it. So yes, like I say, it'd be a policy thing saying, yes, we'll have it even if it's possibly unreadable. We'll try it. Otherwise, yeah, if that saves them the hassle of having to take that file to one side and do manual remedial work on it to get information out of it, then I guess that would be a solution. Whereas other clients will perhaps say, no, we'll just reject it and chuck it or whatever. So yeah, it'll be a policy decision, I think.
Yep.
You could add other options to that, like sort of render, senders, graphic representation, bitmap graphic, and potentially OCR as well is the other thing you can do in there. But once you've got the thing identified as potentially having issues, then you can implement all sorts of policies on it.
Yep, cool. In terms of other approaches, I think you just touched on them just now, Jonathan, with for instance, OCR, doing that comparison at the glyph level and seeing whether you can sort of determine which substitution to make based on that, which becomes again pretty, I think we agree, a challenging exercise.
Yes.
And in terms of importance, I think in terms of vulnerabilities, in comparison to other vulnerabilities in PDF, I think that's pretty much a question mark still. We'd need to do some sort of risk assessment around that. Does that kind of summarize that?
We need to keep gathering data through the stuff that passes through our own systems and.
Yeah. Cool. And the only final thing I'm going to say is that I think we'd mentioned that a good approach would be probably to combine these approaches together from, like we said, options to replace fonts, validating the structure, exporting it, scanning it with AV and sort of running them in sandboxes, constructing a whitelist database and giving sort of policy control over that. And a collection of these would greatly reduce the risk around this. I guess the question would be for us at Glasswall is sort of carrying out that risk assessment and seeing whether we implement all of those or some of those, or whether it's worth even looking at.
Yeah, I think certainly be a case of obviously grading them and rolling some out at different times and different applications in different ways. So
yeah. Okay. Think that's pretty much it, isn't it? Has anyone got?
All right. Any questions?
No, I think that's quite exhaustive. I think actually quite useful. You sort of covered an awful lot of things.
Is there another session later today?
Yes, so I'm probably going to have to cancel the second session because I didn't know how long these discussions would last, or we didn't know how long these discussions would last. So we kind of booked 2 slots just in case. So I think doing that session will pretty much be a rerun of this one.
Okay. All right. So we're going to have no session at 2 p.m.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining this session.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you for the organizers also of this session. All right.
Thank you.
It's very
And
interesting.
yes, and we need organizers to create a debrief after this. I'm going to stop the live now, and then we're going to create the debrief for this.